If any of you are conservationists, you've definitely heard of the IFAW. They are arguably the biggest conservation organization in the world, sponsored by enormous names like the EU, USAID, and the Disney Conservation Fund. In 2023, they spent close to $200 million in relocation, rehabilitation, and habitat recovery for endangered animals on the planet. In 2022, this charitable organization made the inconceivably dangerous decision to release 263 elephants into the Malawi wilderness, smack dab in the middle of multiple farming villages. They left the people with no way to defend their crops, their livestock, or even themselves against the herding elephants. And now, 2 years later, no less than 9 people have died, and millions of dollars worth of damage to homes and lost grains have come to reality. The deadly chain of events started less than a month after the elephants arrived in their new home. With all of the farmlands around them ripe with that year's grains, they just couldn't resist going after the crops with only wooden fences to protect them. They made their way into the neighboring country of Zambia. Not surprising, since most of the southern countries in Africa do not have fenced borders. The horde split into multiple smaller herds, mostly consisting of breeding-aged females and the odd bull elephant. Andrew Feary was out early that morning to tend to his homestead. He'd lived on his patch of land, a stone's throw away from the Malawi border, on the Zambian side, for all of his 64 years on this earth. His father had tended to the fields before him, and so did his father before him. Andrew and his wife raised their children there, and now with 4 of their 5 kids fully grown, they decided to embrace a traditional way of living. Andrew let the family sleep in while he began with the chicken coop, working his way around to the goats, and finally he took a stroll through the field of pearl millet growing on the far side of his land, surrounded by bush and trees. He smiled at his little oasis carved out by the hands before him, and saw his oldest son Abraham coming out of the house, awake and ready to get started on his chores. Andrew waved and turned back to the field. He didn't even notice the gray mounds moving around the tree line. They were so perfectly camouflaged that even those massive bodies could hide until you were practically on top of them. The herd of elephants had just come back from their morning drink, and now, still groggy from their night's sleep, they were moving out to seek food. To them, the figure moving in the distance was so small that they didn't even see Andrew at first. All they saw was a field of yellow grass topped with highly nutritious brown bulbs of grain heads. It was the millet that they were after, and when the lead male stepped out of the trees, he emerged only 6 yards away from Andrew. Andrew was taken so off guard that he screamed in shock at the gigantic beast that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, and that sound broke the dam. The male's reaction was instantaneous. Had Andrew been just a little farther away, the beast might have just flared its ears and allowed the man to back away without further incident. But Andrew's scream coming so suddenly out of the man's mouth, and the bull's precious lady so panicked, its fury was all-consuming, and it saw no other way to protect his cows besides eradicating the threat. It stormed towards Andrew, the ground quaking beneath its feet. Andrew tried to run as best he could. His arthritis-filled legs pumped like they hadn't since he was a boy. But no boy, and certainly no elderly man, could have outrun an elephant bull in its prime, and most definitely not from that distance. Andrew could hear the thundering behind him. The ground was shaking so hard that his knees buckled with the force of it. He went down and found himself on his hands and knees. But before he could get his feet back under him again, the mountain descended on his back. That foot was so big that it engulfed his head, shoulder blades, and back completely. His arms were pushed into the earth by nearly a foot before they snapped in several places. His knees were driven in just as deep. His ribs were so splintered that there were shards embedded all the way down in his bladder. And finally, 10 tons of weight bearing down on him caused his skull to shatter, and the only place the fluid had to go was out. When the beast lifted his foot, the broken remains of Andrew was lying in a hole, surrounded by his own bodily fluids. That might sound like a visceral description, But that was how Abraham found his father, and after Andrew, how 8 others found their kids, their parents, and their friends. All of these deaths were for the same reasons: elephants coming into small farming communities to eat the crops, and while the farmers just happened to be there too. Shortly after Andrew's terrible death, another man was also trampled in the field. He had just moved back to his village to help his sister on her farm. She'd been widowed, and her brother's help was what was keeping her and her children fed. Groups of children walking to school were also stormed by herds of elephants, and a woman who ran out to protect the children was also killed. She managed to distract the bull for long enough for the kids to escape, but sadly, her bravery ended in her death. Besides the 9 deaths in total, more than $3 million worth of damages have been reported. And keep in mind, this is land with hardly any expensive machinery. To have caused $3 million worth of damage is pretty hard to do. IFAW claims that human-animal conflicts is nothing new in Africa, and that they aren't responsible for the deaths. Yet they fail to mention that in the last 2 years, since the elephant's release, more people have died in that time than in the 5 years preceding the elephant's arrival. They also stated that as far as they were concerned, this was the most successful release project that they've ever spearheaded. None of the families have been supported or given aid, unless you count a standard government-issue coffin, and the IFAW certainly hasn't offered to pay for any of the damages, nor did they plan on offering relief to the families, who've quite literally lost the food that were keeping them alive. Yes, those fields were not their source of income to buy things with, it was their source of food. Without it, they won't eat. The communities have taken their children out of school due to fear of the herding elephants. They've set up patrols of people banging pots and setting off fireworks to deter the creatures, and all they ask for is financial aid to set up electric fences around their fields and homes. But one thing is for sure, if something isn't done soon, the people are going to start taking matters into their own hands, and then we'll have 300 or more dead elephants to add to the 9 humans who have already met their terrifying final afflictions.